Hello and welcome to today's course. My name is Nina and I am the founder of Modak Tutoring. So I'm an English, history and religious studies tutor, and I focused a lot on essay writing, analytical skills, critical and thinking skills. So in today's course, we are going to be looking at how do we structure an analytical essay about poetry. A poetry analysis essay. You will need these skills if you are studying English literature, if you're doing your A-levels, your GCSEs, or you're studying English literature at university. Now, this course is aimed at students who are studying at A-level, international baccalaureate, or university level. But if you are just interested in developing your writing skills, or if you are maybe 14, 15, 16 and you just want to develop and get the best grade you can, this course will be useful to you. Now, in this course, I break down in a really simple way how to structure your essay about poetry. Now, the reason I've done this is because when we have analysed a poem, there's a huge amount of information that we could include. But what order do we put it in? Now, we are going to cover different organisational strategies, whether that's linear or non-linear, and I'll go into detail about what those mean. We're going to look at what you include in your introduction and in what order. We're going to be paying specific attention to body paragraphs. How do you structure a body paragraph so that you can really delve into the depth of the material you're studying, specifically a poem? And then how you structure those sentences in what order so that you're not getting comments from your teacher saying, need more detail, develop this, you're missing information. And then we also go into how do you quote from poems correctly and how do you use evidence effectively. We will also look at what do you include in a conclusion. And along through the course, we'll be looking at different examples and I'll be critiquing them and telling you what went well and what didn't. And these examples I've drawn from different websites or scholarly articles so that you can see a different range. So that is what we will be covering in this course. Please join me. We'll go straight over and let's get learning about how we write better essays. How to write about poetry. So when we are analysing poems, it's all well and good doing all the notes, the annotations, looking at the language, but when we actually want to put our thoughts and ideas into something, a coherent piece of writing, often that may be an essay, homework, or maybe you've got an exam where you have to write a poetry analysis essay. How do you go about doing that? Well, the main ideas is we need a thesis, we need evidence, and we need analysis. So let's look at how to write about poetry. So there are some questions to think about before you begin writing about poetry. Now, in the poetry courses that I have, if you've watched any of them, we will be covering these questions when we're going through the poems specifically, but they're also worth thinking about when you're going to start compiling your analysis into a written piece of writing. So let's have a look. Now we need to think about, well, what is the poem saying? And could you paraphrase the poem? Could you summarize it in your own words and explain what the poet is saying in each stanza? You need to think about, well, what is the surface meaning literally what is denoted, what is said? And what are the underlying meanings? So what are the connotations? What is suggested? What are the inferences that you can draw from the words used? From here, we need to think, well, what do the surface or overt and underlying inferred meanings, how do they work together? Do they work together? And the idea of this is we want to understand how is meaning shaped through the language, through the context, through how the poets have structured these poems. And we also want to think, do the multiple layers of meaning, the overt and the inferred, complement or contradict each other or both? Do they create tension or harmony? And again, these questions want to help us understand what is the meaning and how is it shaped? Now, when we have an analytical essay, we need to be able to organize it. So how do we do that? Well, in basic principle, we have 3 parts of an essay, and this is the same for any essay, whether it's a short 1,000 word piece or whether you're writing a dissertation. We need an introduction, we need body paragraphs, and we need a conclusion. But we are going to be really focusing on how do you actually organize your essay, as in the argument. And this is going to be focusing a lot more on the body paragraphs in this next few slides. But we'll look at how do we introduce that? How do we connect that to our introduction and conclusion as well? So how could we possibly organize an essay? Well, the organization depends on the argument that you're making. Now, your thesis statement is very important here because it will help you determine how to organize it, in what order to put these body paragraphs. So let's look at some options. And you can keep this in mind when you're thinking, well, what is the question and how is best to answer it? So first up, chronologically, starting with stanza 1, line 1, and going through the poem stanza by stanza or line by line is one of the simple, easy ways to organize an essay. In some ways, this will be the simplest and best way to organize your essay so it makes sense and helps support your thesis. But this doesn't always work. Sometimes we need non-linear. So you could organize your essay thematically, meaning each body paragraph discusses one theme present in the poem separately, and evidence from across the poem is used as evidence. So what does this mean? That could mean if you're looking at a poem and it has multiple ideas, maybe it's talking about love, maybe it's talking about death, maybe it's talking about life, you would have 3 body paragraphs, 1 to talk about love, 1 to talk about death, and 1 to talk about life, for example. And in those poems, you could use the same piece of evidence twice. And you could also use pieces of evidence from stanza 1, from stanza 5, from stanza 2 in each paragraph, because as the themes run through the poem, you will need to pick out those relevant quotes to support your points in those paragraphs. Third, you could follow a pattern or a cycle present in the poem. Now, this obviously will depend on the poem. If there is no pattern or cycle, you obviously won't use it. However, if there is a pattern or a cycle in the poem, each paragraph could discuss a different pattern or cycle or different parts of the pattern or cycle. Next, different techniques. So you could decide to discuss different poetic techniques in each paragraph. If you're writing a much more technical poetry analysis essay, for example, you're looking at a specific aspect of the poem and how meanings are shaped through the technical aspects or authorial methods, you could, for example, body paragraph 1 would talk about metaphors, body paragraph 2 could talk about oral effects, paragraph 3 could talk about imagery, for example. And in this, evidence from across the poem could and will be used. So you're not limited to just talking about stanza 1 in paragraph 1, body paragraph 1. You would need to look at the metaphors that are present in stanza 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Then, the last one, you could choose a specific line to be the subject of each body paragraph. Now, when you would use this is usually if you're talking about a specific aspect of a poem, or you want to investigate a specific aspect of the poem, and perhaps you've only got a few specific lines that are relevant. Now, this won't stop you from using evidence from the rest of the poem. Actually, no, you need to show how the meaning is shaped within the poem and how those lines interact. But those specific lines of the poem will be the subject, the point you're making in each body paragraph. So here's some important points that we need to discuss with regarding if you are following a non-linear pattern or organization. So that is not the chronological organization of your body paragraphs, but maybe if you're talking about patterns or cycles, techniques, themes, etc., or specific lines. As I've mentioned already, you might feel that you need to use the same piece of evidence twice. This is absolutely fine, so long as within those body paragraphs you emphasize the relationship to the other aspects or techniques in a way that supports the point you're making in that paragraph. So for example, I've actually written an example on the board for you to say how this is different. So for example, if I were discussing the effect of poetic techniques in Sonnet 116 by William Shakespeare, I could organise my essay in a non-linear way, taking each poetic technique and discussing it in each paragraph. So for example, paragraph 1 could talk about the use of rhyme, paragraph 2 could talk about the use of imagery. Now, Sonnet 116 uses a lot of nautical imagery throughout the poem. And one such example is the word bark, which actually refers to what the full word is schoonerbarkentine or barkentine, which is a large 3 or more masted boat. So if you think about a pirate ship, for example, or the ships of war that were used, during Nelson and Napoleon's time, those huge ships. So for example, if I'm going to use the lines about this bark, in paragraph 1, I could use the evidence to talk about how it rhymes with the word mark and how the rhyme affects the reading of the poem, the flow, and what emphasis this has on meaning. So perhaps I would want to talk about how, now in Sonnet 116, Shakespeare talks about love is an ever-fixed mark, and how the tempest, the storms, and the bark is okay. The ever-fixed mark is there to guide the bark. And we can think, well, the rhyme scheme, it makes it regular. Because it's a love poem, it rolls off the tongue. It is quite pleasing to say. And this supports and emphasizes this exploration into this ideal love. In paragraph 2, if I'm thinking about the use of imagery and I want to talk about bark, I would talk with specific reference to the nautical imagery and how it helps build a picture of what love is. That it can brave a storm, a tempest, and stay true. And I would not need to reference the rhyme in this paragraph. It's not important to the point, unless it specifically supports the point I'm making in paragraph 2. But usually the rhyme here, it might be a mention. It's not a specific analysis. So here, I would want to use, the ever-fixed mark is a source, a guide, a light for the ship in storms, and it helps it stay on course. It helps it know where it's going. So that's what I do with paragraph 2. So I'm separating rhyme and imagery in my analysis, but I could, if I wanted to, use the same quote. But you need to make sure that they're used in different ways, this same evidence. So when you organize an essay you need to remember, you can organize an essay in any way so long as you make your argument clear and that everything you write supports your thesis. This is incredibly important. If your points you make in your body paragraphs does not support your thesis, your argument is going to be weak and it's going to fall down, which is not good for marks. Keep the organisation simple. The essay content is complicated enough. So, when you are thinking about your essay writing, you actually need to make the organisation as simple so that a 5 or a 10-year-old could follow the broad subject. Obviously, they wouldn't follow the analytical details as much, but they need to be able to point out this paragraph is about this paragraph is about this, and this paragraph is about this. Don't try and use really overcomplicated language and try and be really sophisticated. It is better to get sense first, then develop your language later. So, what to include in each paragraph is worth mentioning again. Your analysis in your essay must centre around and support your argument, i.e. your thesis statement. That is incredibly important. So, your introduction. Your introduction is where you introduce what you are going to talk to your reader about. You introduce the poet, the poem, you offer a brief and general description of the poem. It's just to tell the reader what you're going to talk about. And then you get more specific as the paragraph goes on about the topic you will be discussing. And this leads the reader to your thesis statement. So you want to start general and then go to detail. And then your thesis statement, you need to avoid general or abstract statements or descriptions of the poem or context, because that's not your argument. You want to be incredibly specific. You don't need to elaborate the details of your argument. This is what you're going to do in the essay. But you do want to show the relationship between the poem and your thesis that gives your point of view of the question, because your thesis is your answer to the question in one sentence. So here I actually have an example introduction from a article that I've put the reference at the bottom by Lawrence Perrine, where he's analysing some of John Donne's poems. So here, let's look at the different features. So John Donne's poem, The Apparition and The Flea, have many features in common. Here, we've already got an introduction of what he is going to talk about. We know we're going to talk about The Apparition and The Flea, 2 poems by John Donne. So we know who, what, and which ones. And we've also got broad introductions. He's going to look at similarities and differences. Okay, both are dramatic monologues in which a male speaker attempts to seduce a female virgin. Both speakers have tried many times before to seduce the woman, but without success. Both speakers use ingenious but bizarre seductive strategies. Both poems give new twists to the conventional cliché in which the cruel mistress is causing her suitor's death by her refusal to satisfy his desires. Both poems end without resolving the conflict. They do not say whether the seduction attempt was successful or unsuccessful. Finally, both poems, especially The Apparition, have been badly misread by an astonishing number of scholars and critics. So here we have a small summary about the poems. He's introduced some challenges to the poems, some differences that we expect him to talk about. And then it may therefore be of value to examine the 2 poems side by side. Though each is self-contained, each may throw light upon the other. So here we don't exactly have a thesis statement in this. This is actually a much longer article, but we do know that his aim is to investigate these poems side by side and see whether we can draw any more information or understanding through their comparison. So that's his aim in this article, and he has told us his aim. Now, the next example I have of an introduction is one from an online website called Literature Essay Samples, and I actually thought this was quite good, and this is to do with Andrew Marvell's Coy Mistress. So obviously this, when you say Marvell, you should have Andrew Marvell when you first mention his name. So Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress was written when Cromwell's Calvinism constrained liberty and free will, and the poem exemplifies an unconventional assertion of love and sexual propositioning while validating the request to yield in sexual activity with 3 arguments structured into stanzas. Here we have a much longer opening sentence, but it introduces who we're talking about, what we're talking about, and gives us a little bit of a brief explanation of the poem, and tells us a little bit about what he might talk about. So these segments of the poem consider what would happen if the speaker and his beloved had eternity, the reality of life's brevity, and the potential joy of the sexual union. Again, we've got a further expansion on the details, but not too much, because we expect him to talk more detailed, more analytically in the rest of the essay. Marvell employs a range of linguistic stylistic devices to sustain his central argument, a central method of sexual imagery. Here, he's starting to introduce some of the things he'll talk about. Again, details, so we know we're going to talk about linguistic stylistic devices in this essay, and how it relates to sexual imagery. And he's already, this writer, asserting that it is a central method of the imagery. And now, the enhancement of the poem caused by his use of enigmatic metaphors in rhymed couplets within an iambic tetrameter makes us question whether Marvell is condemning deceitful male chauvinism or the coyness of females. So here is the thesis statement. And as you can see, this introduction isn't very long, but it's given us an understanding of the poem in general. It's given us a few more details so we know where we're going with it, and it led us to the thesis statement. We know what this author, this writer, is going to be investigating, and what he believes is the answer. So he thinks that the authorial methods, the poetic techniques of metaphors, which are in a specific structure of rhymed couplets and poetic meter of iambic tetrameter, makes us question whether what he's talking about, is it about deceitful men and chauvinism, is wrong, or is the coyness of female. So he's showing he doesn't know which one's which. The whole idea is to make us question. Now, analytical paragraphs must have a credible point, use evidence from the poem, and explain and analyse the evidence to show how it links to your thesis and why it is significant. So when you were studying at GCSEs, for example, or when you were younger, your teachers might have used the P or PEAL paragraph structure. So point, evidence, explain, link. Yes, you're doing this. However, when you're using the evidence and explanations, you want to analyse, not just explain. And you will need to do this 2 or 3 or 4 times within one paragraph. So you're doing the PEEEE all paragraph, rather than just one piece of evidence. You will also need to show how it links to your thesis. So this will be one of the last sentences of that paragraph. You need to link back. And within your analysis and explanation, you need to show, well, why is this evidence significant? Why have you even bothered to use it? Because within analytical paragraphs, you need to lead your audiences. So how you do that is you start from the general and then you get more detailed and specific. You need to give context to your quote and then tell them why it means something. So let's look at this more in depth. So paragraph structure. So first you'll need a topic sentence. You need to tell the reader the focus of your argument in that body paragraph. And that's the point you'll be making in the paragraph. Also, really important, only one point is discussed in each paragraph, otherwise it gets incredibly confusing. Now, once you've introduced your topic for this paragraph, then we need to start giving evidence. But to give evidence in a more sophisticated way, we can't just say, here's the evidence. Sometimes it's relevant, but often we need to actually give some contextual information to introduce the evidence. For example, you could say where the evidence is located in the poem. Is it part of a pattern? You want to let the reader know what he or she should be looking for in this evidence. And then once you've done this, you give the evidence. And then you offer your analysis. So when you're offering your analysis, you're explaining. So first, remember, we still explain things. You explain any problematic language or vocabulary because you don't want to assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. In order to give a full and complete argument, you actually need to get the reader on the same page as you and show the reader why this problematic language or vocabulary is important to note. Maybe it has multiple interpretations, maybe it has multiple definitions, and some are meanings that are denoted, but some are connoted. So some are overt, surface level meanings, others are suggested. You need to tell the reader why this evidence supports your thesis statement and also the point you're making in this paragraph. So you're going to lead the reader on this journey with you. So you're going to explain anything that's problematic and then tell them why is it significant to the point you're making in the paragraph. You need to make your interpretation clear to the reader. And this is one of the most important part of your writing, because if you don't make your analysis and your interpretation clear to the reader, they won't understand why on earth you're using this piece of evidence. And lastly, you will need a linking sentence. So the final sentence of your paragraph offers, in a way, an overall conclusion to the paragraph and links back to your thesis. These linking sentences are very useful when you're writing your overall conclusion as well, because you can just go back to each paragraph at the end and then think, okay, linking sentences, these are the main points, this is how it links. I just need to use that in my conclusion. So don't ever assume evidence speaks for itself. That is your job. So always make sure you give more detail to develop your argument. And to develop your argument, you explain and analyse your evidence more. You spell it out as if you were talking to a 10-year-old. So using evidence effectively. So here are some don'ts. So don't use a quote or line of a poem without providing context, whether that's the location in the poem, relation to the pattern, imagery, etc., or the historical context. Don't throw in a quote in a sentence of its own, because then it's a floating quote, not linked to anything, and it's like, why is it there? Don't provide an opinion without giving evidence to show why it is valid. An opinion is just opinion without evidence. You need to give evidence to show the reader why your opinion is worth listening to. And again, don't assume the quote speaks for itself. You need to do that. You need to lead the reader on the journey. And here are some do's. So using evidence effectively, do sandwich your evidence between contextual information and analysis. Do tell your reader why the evidence is significant to your argument, your thesis statement. That's very important. Do tell the reader what they should be looking for or to be aware of from the evidence, because you can't assume that they know what they're looking for. That's your job by writing an analytical and argumentative essay, is to persuade your reader. So you can't assume they know what's in your head. You need to tell them. Do explain any difficult or troubling vocabulary or syntax, because this will help your reader understand what you're trying to get at and any possible interpretations of a poem. And limit the length of your quotations to a workable size. So what this means is use only the most relevant part of the quote. Don't take a whole long line, for example. It is too long. That said, let's look at how we quote from poems correctly. Because, as we know, poems are written on lines in stanzas. It's not like prose where we have whole sentences. So it's a bit different. Okay, poems run across lines and the punctuation doesn't correspond to the end of the line, as we mentioned. As such, when we want to quote a longer line, or we want to quote a couple lines or 1.5 lines, we use a forward slash to indicate the end of a line. So for example, here I've got half and one line from Sonnet 116. So love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds. That forward slash tells me that love is not love is on one line, and which alters when it alteration finds is on the next line. But if we want to, that's easy if we just have a shorter quote. If we want to quote more than 3 lines, we need to do something a little bit different with our formatting in our essay. And you can do this when you're handwriting an essay as well as when you're typing an essay. So for 3 lines, or more than 3 lines, we have to actually go to a new line in your paragraph, indent and present it as it appears in the poem. So here I've got an example of a sentence from a body paragraph and then a quote. So the use of rhetorical questions in stanza 3 of John Donne's The Flea emphasised the tone of the speaker as shocked at the woman's killing of the flea and seemingly chastising her for her behaviour when saying, and here I've got a comma because I want to quote 4 lines. Now, as you can see from the formatting, I have indented, meaning there is a space between where the line of the paragraph starts and where I've actually put the quote from the poem. Then I have given 4 lines from the poem. It is punctuated and formatted as it is in the poem. And I've put it in quotation marks because my whole paragraph here is italicized. You could also use italics if you are not using quotation marks, for example. And then I follow on the rest of the paragraph underneath and I go back to normal formatting. But as you can see, I have left of the second line of the paragraph empty. And then I start again. So these questions accuse the addressee, the woman, of wrong action, with further emphasis added as they are at the beginning of the 3rd stanza. The use of catalexis and harsh consonant sounds of the sea of cruel further cries out this accusation of this woman's action. So here I have quoted the text, then I've gone on to analyse, and if I were to carry on this paragraph, I'd probably relate back and quote smaller parts of these lines. So let's look at some examples of a body paragraph. Okay, so here this is a body paragraph for Sonnet 116 by a woman called Jane Rossner, and the reference is at the top there, so if you wanted to go and have a look at the whole essay, you are more than welcome. You can get it on JSTOR. So even here, though, there are complications. The sentence, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." So here you can see the use of quotations. And she's used a forward slash because we know that these lines, there is more than one line, it's 2 lines. It's forceful, complete. It is an heroic oath whose strength defies the strictures of iambic pentameter or the end stopped line. So here she's included a quote and then she has gone on to analyse it. And I think I got this paragraph from very much in the middle of the essay. The speaker has borrowed from the marriage ceremony, yet he has changed its language in significant ways. First of all, what the speaker regards is the marriage of true minds. The marriage ceremony speaks of two people, lovers, who are being joined not only spiritually but also physically. Each pledges. So here in this sentence, I want to draw your attention to specifically, is the marriage ceremony speaks of two people, lovers, who are being joined not only spiritually but also physically. So this is a little bit of an introduction into what we need to look for in the quote that's going to come next. Each pledges with my body I thee worship. So here you're already primed that two people joined together physically and spiritually. So when we then look at this quote, with my body I thee worship, you're thinking literally and physically. Literally and spiritually. It's not just something that we might think, it's just metaphorical. And then she contrasts this and carries on introducing quotes and then analysing them. So I would critique her actually, because her sentences are quite short, but when you are writing your essays, just as long as it's clear, is the most important. So if the reader understands you, that is the most important. So here let's look at, so a little further down, this disturbingly suggests that impediments do exist, but either that the speaker will protect the marriage from them by keeping them out, or that he has knowledge of them which he will not confess, or that he will willfully refuses to acknowledge them. So here she's expanding on the previous quotes, the idea of admitting impediments. This is her analysis, and once you've given these quotes, you do need analysis sentences to tell the reader what they need to be aware of. Then the speaker's refusal to admit impediments with suggestions of willful denial of his knowledge of impediments to a marriage which he has deliberately made disembodied begins to clarify the nature of and reasons for the resistance and vigilance we sense in the poem. So this is actually a good summary sentence where you start to get the idea of what she's getting at, and she's drawing this argument to a close. So let's look at one other paragraph. So this is from Literature and Essay Samples, which are the links at the bottom, and about Andrew Marvell's poem again. So let's look at this. I quite like this example. It's a more structured example, and something, if you're writing at A level, this is the kind of level that you need to be aiming for, and the structure you need to be aiming for. So the Prechartian language used by Marvell fundamentally determines the structure of To His Coy Mistress, as the speaker commences the poem by suggesting the consequences of acquiring eternity to pursue their courtship. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. So here he's given us his topic sentence for the paragraph, and actually the writer's used a quote at the same time. Now, I wouldn't always use a quote here. You could put that quote in a line of its own. But then he goes on to analyse this by applying hyperbole, so dramatic language, metaphor, and the conditional tense to this devious speculation. He implies that the speaker lacks boundless amounts of time to wait for their sexual union. However, he attains such a persuasive trait through metaphor that unlocks the emotional barrier of doubt in the mistress. So this analysis sentence is telling us what we need to look for in this quote. We need to look for the application of these authorial methods, these poetic techniques, and that it implies that the speaker has lots of time to wait. But then, and here we're seeing some tension within the poem and by the analysis, he's going much more on a psychological analysis, that through the metaphor it is persuasive and it starts to break down these emotional barriers of doubt in the mistress. And then he expands on this a bit more, and he says, Marvel recognizes that metaphor is pervasive in language, as a listener is thrown into a state of momentary uncertainty which creates an alternate dimension to our view of reality. Now here he's actually incorporating quotes, analysis from other thinkers to expand on his point. And he's giving evidence for the evidence, or evidence for his analysis, which is good because when we want to build a more sophisticated argument, we actually need to draw on the works of other scholars. Because you could have an opinion, but you need to prove it as well. You need to prove your opinion with use of the poem, and if you want to go up to an A or A star grade, you need to incorporate other interpretations. Now, he suggests that this woman's coyness is almost criminal through the imagery fabricated by the use of the word crime. This implies that rejecting sex automatically makes her a lawbreaker, alluding to the religious and moral expectations of the 17th century, where fornication was seen as a crime as the church morality dominated social behaviour. So in this, I think the beginning of this body paragraph is really good. I think it could use a bit of help at the end because it could be developed more. And we could actually develop this paragraph a bit more to link together the context as well as this analysis. Because when we're using context, we don't want to just throw in the context sentence at the end of a paragraph because it doesn't actually show how it shapes meaning, not fully. Here I have a few more questions than I have answers. But on the whole, this is a well-structured paragraph. Apart from that, I just want more development later. And then because you would want him to also develop on this idea that he talked about in the beginning, that the Petrarchan language used fundamentally determines the structure to his coy mistress. And that suggesting the consequences of acquiring eternity to pursue their courtship. So we would want him to look at this a little bit more, this idea of time. The conclusion. So the conclusion is a final summary of everything you have argued in the essay already. It's where you offer your overall conclusion and show the reader why you have proved your thesis. You do not need to add anything new in a conclusion. You should not add anything new in a conclusion. Why is this? Well, because it's very confusing if you randomly put in information that you should have put in the body paragraphs in the conclusion. It will make your argument weaker. If you have not included it in the body paragraphs and it's an exam setting, then it probably wasn't useful and leave it out. If you're doing coursework, you need to think, well, why have I included it in the conclusion? Is it actually relevant enough that I should go and find where it should go in the body paragraph? So to structure your conclusion, you structure your conclusion in the same order as your essay, because remember, we want to keep the structure simple. You restate your argument, your thesis statement. You restate what you've argued in body paragraphs 1 to 3 or 4 or 5 in order, and the conclusions you have drawn. Don't do it in a different order because that's just completely confusing. You have organised your paragraphs in a logical way to support your thesis statement and to develop what you want to argue. So keep it the same in the conclusion. And then show how these conclusions prove your thesis and offer your overall conclusion. So let's look at an example conclusion. Here, the pain and finally the heroism of Sonnet 116 derive from the speaker's assumption that the work of time is destruction and that a person's truth deteriorates just as surely as does his beauty. Now you can, this is actually the conclusion I believe we looked at maybe an introduction of this same article. So here, this first sentence is drawing us to a close. It's saying what has been argued and what the thesis was in this essay. It seems that the friend, even in Sonnet 116, is for the speaker the pattern for all living things. The speaker sees no possibility that the friend's corruption was single, limited to him. Consequently, there is no safe place and no ordinary language for love on this earth. We might hope that although time makes men grow old physically, the process need not be seen as one of corruption, but only one of natural and proper change, and more important, it need not be linked with the deterioration of truth. But there is no such solace available to the speaker. So here, in this these few lines, we've got a summary of what has been talked about in the body of the essay. We've seen that they're looking at the speaker and the idea of a pattern for all living things, love for the earth. We hope that although time makes men grow physically, the process need not be seen as corruption, but something proper and natural. So here we're seeing the conclusions of the essay following through logically from one to the other. And then this last line, instead he sees love on its journey, vigilant, having renounced all, with only terrible knowledge of time and heroic determination to preserve love from its ruin. And that is the concluding sentence. It's drawing everything together. And it's telling you what the reader, the writer, the scholar's main conclusion is. So for those of you studying in the AQA system for A-level, you can have a look at some examples, and have put the links on for you, some example answers. I also recommend just keep reading. Challenge yourself to read academic articles from university professors, because this will develop your understanding of more sophisticated language. Use books from the library, from renowned scholars, and keep challenging yourself to be more clear, more precise in your language. And that's how you can develop. Make sure the structure is simple, really simple, so that the complicated argument you're writing in your essay can come through and be understandable. So that's it for the course. Thank you for joining me. I really hope you found this course useful. It is a course that I developed for my A-level students to help them with their exams and also their coursework. With this course, the next thing you need to do is actually go away and practice. So if you have any coursework that you've got to do for school or university, or if you don't, what you could do is go to my other poetry courses, have a look, do some research, and then use one of the questions from those courses and try and answer it in an essay. Essay writing is a skill that you develop over time. The first time you write an essay in the first draft, especially if you've taken my other essay writing course, isn't going to be good, and that's okay. The real crafting of language comes in the editing. But go through the process of planning, researching, and write, edit, and proofread an essay. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you in the next course. Bye bye for now.